Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. I hope everyone had a good lunch and ready for another amazing panel presentation. So my name is Milena Melian, and my panel is going to be about recovery of damages, property rights, corporate accountability for international humanitarian law, and international human rights law violations. Ladies and gentlemen, we were supposed to have Professor Michael Strauss with us as well, but unfortunately, he is sick at his hotel, so he's not going to be able to join us. He had arrived from Paris, France. We're definitely going to miss him, but we do have another amazing speaker and also one of our own CFTJ Law Clinic who's also going to be joining us from Stepanakert, so stay tuned for that. And without further ado, I do want to introduce our very first speaker, who is Esther Jeremitsky. She is a promising PhD candidate who's currently conducting research at the Queen Mary University of London. And her work focuses on the critical role of international criminal law in regulating and holding social media companies accountable for their contribution to the incitement of war crimes and violations against crimes against humanity on the internet. Her research is essential to help strengthen the legal framework for addressing such crimes in the digital age. Esther is a dedicated scholar who has demonstrated her expertise and commitment to the field of international criminal law. Her work has already attracted significant attention in academic circles and beyond, and she is poised to become a leading voice in this critical area of research. Her dedication to the studies and her passion for her research are inspiring, and her contributions are sure to have a significant impact on the field of international criminal law. So let's please welcome Esther Jeremitsky, who is joining us today virtually.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, but maybe in a second. It's black right now. Is it supposed to be black?
Just a second.
We can see it now. We could see it now.
You can see it?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah?
and I do want to tell the audience this is going to be a very interesting presentation, and I do expect to get a lot of questions from you. So as you're listening, please prepare questions for the Q&A session so that we could address them towards the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for the kind introduction. I am very sorry that I cannot be here with you today in Armenia, but I hope you're enjoying the conference very much. And I hope that the presentation, even though it's online, can give you a couple of insights into some of the research that I'm doing and how it particularly relates to genocide. And that's why I decided to structure the presentation in a little bit more of a positive tone. There is a lot of research currently being done on how social media plays a role in a lot of the conflicts that we are facing today in the world. But what if we rephrase the question and we ask, what role can social media play in preventing genocide? This is something that I'm going to touch briefly, but I would just like for you to wrap your minds around this question throughout the presentation. And hopefully in the discussion, you can contribute some of your own ideas of how we can make that future possible. Before I start, I wanted to share with you a quote that really inspired me throughout my work and that really centers the questions that are very important when considering how can we deal with social media's role in genocide. This is a quote by Hannah Arendt. I am sure you're all aware of her work, and her work on the origins of totalitarianism until today is essential to understanding how even today countries and states can turn into a totalitarian regime. Mass propaganda discovered that its audience was ready at all times to believe the worst, no matter how absurd, and did not particularly object to being deceived because it held every statement to be a lie anyhow. If you let that statement sink in for a second, the first thoughts that I had when I first heard about it is that that is exactly what fake news and the misinformation that we are witnessing on social media is making populations across the world feel. When we do not have the awareness anymore to decipher what is true and what is not, we start believing that everything is a lie anyhow. This is a very dangerous starting point for a totalitarian regime or any other sort of propaganda to turn people into violent users of social media. thinking about this, I started doing some more research into the question of what path we see for our future in a world where we don't know anymore what is a lie, what is propaganda, and what is just content on social media that is absolutely fine to consume. Two questions that I have in this regard is, what kind of future do we want? First, a world where we work towards ensuring that our technology is safe and that it drives us towards a version of our world where collective well-being can be ensured. This particularly in relation to my topic and also the topic of the conference means, do we want technology to contribute to a world where international human rights law and international criminal law is respected, a world where technology does not drive crimes such as genocide but prevents it? Or do we want a world where the technology limits our well-being, replicates the biases that exist in our society, and ultimately enhance a fast digression of society as a whole? Again, this is a very important question when we think about genocide. There is two versions of the 21st century, one where we finally combat the crime of genocide, and the second that is far more gruesome and that I don't want to emphasize too much, is where technology actually aggravates and makes the possibility of genocide not only more acute, but also more deadly and dangerous in reality. I want you to consider for a second some of the individuals that I'm going to show you now on the presentation. I'm sure you recognize these are the CEOs of, on the left, we have the Meta CEO who's in charge of Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, some of the biggest social media platforms of our age. On the other side, we have the CEO of what we know in Europe and North America as TikTok. TikTok is something that is growing just as fast as Meta, and therefore everything that I'm going to be talking about in the next slides also applies to TikTok. Here we have a picture of Elon Musk, the current CEO of Twitter, and on the other side we have, perhaps controversially, the chief editor of the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer. He was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity and the incitement of those crimes during the Nuremberg trials in the 1940s. What is very, very interesting to consider here, and why I'm giving you these pictures, is that I want you to be able to follow my thought process and understand that nowadays we really have to see the responsibilities of an editor-in-chief of an extremist newspaper in comparison to somebody who is, in other words, not the editor-in-chief, but the executive leader of a platform or of many platforms that allow for content that is similar to that which we have seen in newspapers such as Der Stürmer. This is a very controversial argument. There is a lot of backlash that I've had over the course of working on this, in particular with the idea that algorithms and the content that we have on social media does not equal to what an editor has and the editorial control an editor has in a newspaper. But there are many legal similarities in terms of the control that both these individuals exercise over their company. And with that in mind, I have a couple of slides just making us wrap our mind around the way that mass media has changed. We had the television. Here we have the radio in Rwanda, which I think many of you know was a very, very important tool during the Rwandan genocide. And in fact, there are two media trials that were done at the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where the leading officials of those companies that distribute the radio in Rwanda and the newspaper in Rwanda were convicted of inciting genocide. Again, I am trying to show that there is a progressive connection between the television, the radio, social media, and the newspaper, and how these tools have played a role in international crime and have been, as a matter of certainty, been acknowledged by international courts throughout the 20th and the 21st century. The latest conviction of a media executive under the International Criminal Law regime was the appeals case of 2007 of the media trials, which shows that this is a very acute and acknowledged topic within international criminal law. This is an example of Der Stürmer, which shows the front page of the Nazi newspaper, for which Julius Streicher did get the death sentence, which was one of the most severe punishments that the Nuremberg Tribunal presented in its reasoning, which shows that this was really how grave his crime was regarded by the people that were analyzing to what extent it played a role in the genocide during the Nazi regime. Here I have an example of the New York Times, and this is just so we can lead on into the current state of the world, which, even though the New York Times is, of course, still an important newspaper in many countries, especially the United States, it is a very known fact nowadays that all of these icons that you see on the screen have replaced what we know today as the most important mass media tool. If I was with you now in Armenia, I would have asked you how many of you turn to any of those apps every day for any kind of information, especially Twitter. I am sure that many of you are going to say you do use it more than buying a newspaper at the newsstand. And this brings me to some of the concrete findings of the first elements of my research. The first point to remember is that social media platforms are fundamentally changing the way individuals, communities, and societies interact with each other. This also means that individuals that are international criminals or societies that are at danger or at risk of going through an international criminal offense, these platforms have just as an effect on those situations as in peaceful countries. And this is why a particularly striking example is social media's role in the proliferation of hate speech, and there is an increase in violence caused by the dissemination of harmful online speech relating to genocide. One of the examples that are frequently talked about, and that is not as central to my research anymore because there is sufficient proof brought out by many sources, such as the best one, I think, is the Reuters report on the role that Facebook played in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. The role that Facebook played in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar has been proven to have been really extensive. And what's worse is that there hasn't been any changes that were really concretely addressing some of the important elements that were highlighted in the role that Facebook played in the Rohingya genocide. The UN affirmed that Myanmar's inhabitants used Facebook to incite violence and hatred against the Rohingya, with the platform turning into a beast. And this is a quote directly cited from the UN Human Rights Report on the situation in Myanmar from 2017. Talking about this, I want you to just think back for a second to an earlier slide where I mentioned that Julius Streicher was convicted of inciting genocide, and this is similarly to what happened with the role of Facebook and the Rohingya. However, there was no prosecution on this. Another really interesting different context, but something that really shows the dynamics that we're facing, is that a recent study in Germany found that anti-refugee hate speech on Facebook predicted violent crimes against refugees in municipalities with above average use of the platform. And this study's results suggest that social media acts as a propagation mechanism between online content and real-life violence. We are now at a moment where the study was done in 2019. Newer studies show that there is no doubt that there is a direct causation between content and the systematic use of social media and the aggravation of real-life violence. One of the most recent sad examples was an uprising in Brazil of a right-wing movement that originated entirely from a campaign that was launched on Facebook. The study that I'm working on presents a comparative legal analysis of the current legal approaches to social media regulation under the United States, German, and international law. And this I do to assess to what extent current legislation is effective at externally regulating harmful content on platforms that lead to genocide. Some of the findings that I have already concluded is that currently jurisdictions, the ones that I mentioned, do not provide an effective framework to regulate harmful content of that extent on social media. One of the cases that I recently started working on is, I'm sure you're aware of the Supreme Court Gonzalez case in the United States, where there is an accusation that Facebook played a role in, and Facebook and Google and YouTube played a role in some of the terrorist attacks in Paris, and looking at the responsibility of the algorithms and the liability of the executives, and whether they have played a role in actually allowing for that situation of physical violence to happen, is one of the central questions that we need to ask ourselves, and really find solutions in all the jurisdictions that face this issue. And this is all because it's a global phenomenon. This is why social media platforms' transnational nature demonstrates that international law is the correct approach and is the most important approach to really tackle this issue. Similarly to the questions of the environment, we need to tackle this issue from a very unified, harmonized angle, legally speaking. And I would like to close some of my remarks with the questions that I asked you in the beginning. What kind of future do we want? Do we want to be consumers, or do we want to be active citizens that protect each other from the influences that we have online? In my research, I do propose some of solutions that we can have to really work on this, not just legally, but also technically. The first step is of technical nature. We need to redesign the algorithms that promote some of the violent content. And this is the responsibility of the executives that I have mentioned before. The second step is of institutional nature. I'm working towards elaborating on a definition where human rights obligations apply to social media platforms. And the third step is of symbolic nature, and that is a commitment to international human rights on behalf of all the major platforms. This is not an exhaustive list, and I look forward to your ideas, but this is something that is urgently needed to be thought about and needed to be expanded. And just to finish off, some of the things that we do need to protect on social media is the activism and the citizen-led fight against state-led disinformation. And that is why we need to use international human rights law to really balance the act between the misinformation and the information that empowers individual users to do something good for their society. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing with you.
Thank you, Esther. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions, especially social media, and especially the fact that, you know, the open source investigation during just the video evidence, the photographic, the horrific videos that have been appearing on social media post the 44-day war. And promoting propaganda, fake news, and all of that has been used in social media. So I'm sure the audience is going to have a lot of questions about bringing potential cases against whether Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and how to hold them accountable. But before we get to the Q&A session, we do have our student from Stepanakert again. I'm not sure if we're able to establish a connection with our student, Snezhana Tamrazian. Oh, she's here. Welcome, Snezhana. So our Snezhana is a law student at the Artsakh State University and serves as the chairman of a youth organization called the Union of Youth for Justice. With passion for defending the interests of her country and its people, she joined the Center for Truth and Justice as a volunteer to raise awareness of the situation in Artsakh and make a contribution to the pursuit of justice. As a future lawyer, Snezhana is eager to collaborate with skilled and professional judges and lawyers from CFTJ to uncover the whole truth of what happened in Artsakh and ensure that its history is not distorted. By collecting stories and testimonies, she's confident that justice will be served for the people of Artsakh. With that, welcome, Snezhana, and hopefully we do not have any technical difficulties this time. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I greet you all from blockaded Artsakh, and I would really like to be with you today, but Azerbaijan dictates its own rules. I am Snezhana, I live in Artsakh. My mother is a refugee for Azerbaijan, Baku, and I don't want to be repeat her fate. Author Michael Morpurgo said, "When people make wars, they make refugees." The global refugee crisis has more than doubled in scope. In 2022, the UNHCR announced that we have surpassed the 100 million mark for total displacement, meaning that over 1.2% of the global population have been forced to leave their homes. Among these people are over 32 2.5 million refugees. Between 1988 and 1992, more than 500,000 Armenians were forcibly displaced from Azerbaijan. They were subjected to pogroms, massacres, repression, homelessness, expropriation, solely due to their ethnic origin. It was because they were Armenian and they lived in Azerbaijan as citizens of Azerbaijan. But being Armenian, they were targeted, their homes were confiscated, they were terrorized and killed. In the darkness of the night, Azerbaijan carried out this heinous policy, and those who survived escaped to Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. Armenia lost more than 110,000 apartments and private households, including businesses and professional practices. All this was lost without any attention to any type of compensation for damages. But how many times can the same ethnic group become a refugee and displaced in one lifetime? If you are Armenian and you live anywhere near Azerbaijan, the answer is at least twice, if not 3 times. After the 44-day war in 2020, the 193 communities on Artsakh that were inhabited by Armenians are now occupied by Azerbaijan without a single Armenian living there. As a student of law CFTJ, I collect testimonial evidence to document the truth about the Armenians who have experienced becoming refugees and being displaced more than once in their lifetime. This repetitive loss and displacement has become a constant among my people. In September of 2020, when Armenians had to leave Hadruch, Shushi, and the surrounding towns and villages in a matter of hours, as they were bombed and shelled by Azerbaijan, they left believing they would return. They left with just the clothes on their backs and their passports on hand, believing they would return to their homes, farms, and lands in a matter of days. However, they never returned and left behind villages, towns, and cities intact, leaving behind their schools, community centers, museums, stores, churches, grave sites, and thousands of their homes with all of their personal belongings, including their family heirlooms and family photographs. They are unable to visit the churches where they married and baptized their children, or visit the gravesite of their loved ones. This repetitive trauma of becoming refugees and forced displacement has made an entire ethnic group unable to exist as a community that has lived on its ancestral lands for thousands of years. It is in a sense the removal of Armenians from this region called Artsakh. The pain the people of Artsakh feel is one that dates back to the early 1900s and the horrific fate of the Armenians from the genocide. With the blockade of Artsakh and the Aliyev regime, every family in Artsakh wonders if they are next to be forced to leave their home and homeland. The Aliyev regime wants our lands, but wants them devoid of Armenians. 100 years later, history repeats itself. What I was taught about my ancestors in school has come to haunt me today. And I too wonder, will I become a refugee too? We hope that the skies over Artsakh will someday burst into beautiful blue colors instead of dreadful gray. Like Martin Luther King, we too have a dream. Our dream is that every inhabitant of this majestic land lives free of fear of losing their home, livelihood, and family. Thank you.
Thank you, Snezhana. We all have a dream, and thank you for that emotional ending as well. We do have a lot of questions, Esther, specifically for you. You touched a very interesting topic, social media, corporate accountability. One question that we do want to ask, we have from the audience is, I'm not sure if you know, but during the 2020 44-day war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, there was a large you know, boats, trolls pretty much on social media accounts, which has been actually proven. Someone disclosed that information on Facebook. So the question is, what kind of potential, maybe even a class action case could be brought up against Facebook to hold them accountable for, you know, allowing such thousands of, you know, fake accounts to be promoting hate speech?
Thank you very much for the question. And yes, indeed, I have looked at there's a really interesting report that I recommend by the European Commission on the 4-day war and what role misinformation and disinformation has played. So there is a lot of evidence concretely on the role that Facebook played. And it's not just a perceived, but it is a real threat that has been recorded by researchers. There is a very interesting proposal that I could think of and that has been suggested in other cases, and that is indeed, as you mentioned, a class action case in the United States. There is a case at the moment in terms of the Rohingya genocide that I spoke about in California, at a lower court in California, that has been brought about by refugees, Rohingya refugees that do not have a US citizenship, but that went to court in the United States against Facebook, which is an American company. And I am in touch with the team of lawyers that are working on that case. And their strategy on that is that there is going to be reparations for the Rohingya people that are part of the class action case. Unfortunately, there is a problem that the legal team is facing, and that is that Meta is consistently pushing forward. That means not meeting the deadlines of when they have to deliver certain documents, which is basically sabotage of the court case. So they keep having to postpone any hearings, any trials. So again, this is an opportunity that could be used for Armenia and for an Armenian class action case. But the realities of it, as perceived by the legal team, is that Meta is not cooperative and that they are standing in the way of real measures such as reparations that could come out of it, which again brings us back to we don't have the right laws that could really effectively make companies such as Meta pay for something like that at present.
Thank you for that. The other question we have from the audience is, during your presentation, you spoke about social media and how it could help to prevent genocide. The question is whether social media in this case could help to contribute to the recognition of genocide or maybe recognition of some, you know, human rights violations taking place.
Yeah, so again, this is something that I really think is really important to protect, and that is that social media at the same time allows citizens and normal people to raise their voice and say, this is what the human rights violations are in our country, and our country is not reporting on it. I think that there is a very interesting collaboration going on at the moment between Iranian women and their use of social media. And I'm actually attending an event just on that this week. There's a big topic on how people that are in charge of companies, for example, of companies that are based in the Silicon Valley, if they really acknowledge there is a problem in Iran, for example, or there is a problem in that region, and they fight for better policies in that region, then there is something that can be said as a preventive policy on behalf of the social media platforms. But that is nothing legal. That would just be a company policy that can be enacted in order to prevent genocide and help people in the region raise their voices.
I do have a question about some software developers' algorithms. I just want to ask the author to come forward to read the question. And before you do that, I'll pose the next question so we don't waste time. The question is about a corporate accountability before the International Criminal Court and the fact that it's a contentious topic of debate. And what is your perspective on potential criminal liability for corporations?
Yeah, so actually my focus is the International Criminal Court. As I think many of you are aware, the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over corporations as such. There is a very big movement on the ecocide front where people are trying to change the Rome Statute, which is the document which has founded the ICC. But in the current political climate, it is very unlikely, and I think there's a lot of consensus on the fact that we are not going to change the Rome Statute, and that means we're not going to change the jurisdiction of the ICC in the next 10 years. So the only thing that we can work with in terms of corporate liability and corporate responsibility under the ICC is the responsibility of the executives. And there are provisions within the Rome Statute that allow for civil commanders, which in normal terms mean CEOs of companies, to be held liable for actions that have contributed to an international crime such as genocide or war crimes.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to shift the topic a little bit because you did start off talking about specific print publications, for example, articles, that have appeared in New York Times. And we do have a lot of cases when such one-sided, maybe fake news publications are made, and kind of shifting the focus from social media. Such publications are made all the way to New York Times or many other reputable, publications. So what kind of accountability can we pursue or can we look into in those cases?
That is something that is not necessarily my topic, but there is much more jurisprudence and precedent and laws that people can have access to when it comes to newspapers, radio, and television, because we, or the legislators, understand much better the dynamics within a newspaper. So they understand, okay, if this is published in the New York Times, we can trace it back to who is the editor-in-chief, we can trace it back to the journalist, we can trace it back to the other people that were involved in pitching the story. So there is a much better understanding. If something goes wrong, accountability is much more easily established, and less problems are faced on if a victim claims a case, chances of success are much higher when it comes to print.
Thank you for that. And I think there's an audience who's going to be asking a question. Oh, there she is.
Yes, thank you very much. Your work is so important. Would you consider adding to your list of 3 ways of holding social media accountable, encouraging software developers in those companies to demand or implore their corporate leaders to take responsibility for the algorithms?
Thank you so much. That is such an interesting insight. And it is a very morally kind of difficult question for me to answer, because in international criminal law, we never hold accountable, let's say, the foot soldiers. So we are not allowed to say, okay, software developers, designers of algorithms, this is your responsibility, because it is not their responsibility. They have a contract and they are under the direct command, as in military terms, of the executives of huge corporations like that. Well, yes, it might be great if we have software developers and designers kind of stand up and maybe say this is not something we want to continue working for. It would be unfair to place the burden on that, but it should be maybe part of the mix of the solutions of really changing firm behavior top down.
Thank you, Esther. The other question I have for you is, you talked about with the case of Myanmar and, how Facebook helped to pretty much prove genocide. So in a case where you have, for example, Facebook, where war crime is pretty much documented, so would you say it's a good thing? Because on the other side, on the other hand, we have Azerbaijan pretty much, let's say, publishing videos of executions, beheadings, and all of that, which is also considered a psychological terrorism, it's a psychological torture. So how do those conflicting, ideas would balance out in a way?
Yeah, I think that the question of evidence is always very difficult to assess. The problem is that Facebook has not been really collaborative when it comes to giving evidence. So whenever we do ask for evidence from Facebook for a trial, for example, there was a trial regarding Kenya and some of the international crimes that were committed in Kenya a few years ago. Facebook refused to hand evidence in because they say, well, we deleted, let's say, beheading videos or whatever it was, and that means that we do not have this anymore and we do not store it. We cannot help you anymore within the investigation. So I think that And that led to another court case where basically the Meta was sued to reveal the evidence, and they didn't because they didn't have it anymore. So the problem is that I think that the beheading videos, etc., are actually useless when it comes to evidence gathering. And while there are a lot of NGOs using the evidence that or using the content to report on war crimes, in Ukraine, for example, there's a huge effort of collecting content online and saying maybe one day we will use it. This is not coming from the platforms themselves. So again, this is not something that is used to prevent war crimes from the platform, but this is something that people do to make the best out of the situation of these things being online. But there's no collaboration on behalf of the platforms to prosecute war crimes.
We do have another question. Given the extensive reach of social media and its global ubiquity, how can we conceptualize territorial jurisdiction under international criminal law in regards to social media executives?
Yes, so one of the problems we have is that the International Criminal Court, the one that exists today in The Hague, does not have jurisdiction over nationals that do not hold the citizenship of states that are part of the Rome Statute, which means that, for example, any kind of individual that is American that is in control of Meta or Twitter, or an individual that is Chinese that is in control of TikTok, so both countries would not fall under the Rome Statute. So this is where we have these territorial boundaries that come into play, where we can't actually in reality prosecute them at the moment. But when it comes to prosecuting such cases, as I said, for example, the class action case in California, it works in terms of universal jurisdiction. You can use international criminal law in national courts, but the question is to what extent is this useful? Because this is a whole nother topic that opens up questions of, for example, if we have a law in Germany and that changes the way Twitter has to operate, what's the use if when we go to the next country, Austria, Twitter operates differently again? And so in practice, we need to have an international regulation that can be enforced in an international court. Otherwise, there is just this chaos that we have today, where we have one regulation in one country and the next, and we access content from all around the world anyways, and that's unstoppable no matter the legislation.
Another question we just received is, we talked about incitement of genocide through social media. Is there a potential way of demonstrating an intent to destroy through Facebook or other social media posts?
So the intent to destroy on behalf of the executive branch of a social media company is going to be really hard to prove. I don't think it's reasonable to assume that somebody like Elon Musk has the intent to commit a genocide in Ukraine. This would be very far-fetched, and there would not be enough evidence, I think, ever to prove that, if that even was the case, which it probably isn't. So the problem that we have here is that we cannot fulfill the intent to genocide, which is why under the current framework, we are probably going to have to deal with less, let's say, horrible crimes, or just as horrible, but under the doctrinal definition, crimes against humanity and war crimes will be much easier to prove in terms of the responsibility that executives had in preventing those crimes from happening, because you don't need to prove the intent of them wanting to destroy a whole group or population. And this is a very difficult kind of legal debate, where we enter into recklessness and negligence, and whether having the intent or having the knowledge of and not doing anything against it equals to the same offense or not. And as there is no precedent on that yet, when it comes to corporations that are as big as social media companies, that is something that the ICC prosecutor would have to weigh on and decide in practice, given the evidence they have.
Great. I promised the last question, but you mentioned a lot of issues. The fact that there's national laws, there's no uniform, consistent legislation present. Can you point out like one or two? This has to do a little bit more maybe with advocacy, issues that NGOs maybe even could be working to create a more consistent and uniform application of law when it comes to social media, because it's so present in our daily lives, but there seems to be, but they're behind when it comes to the legal aspect.
Yes, I think there's a lot of interesting initiatives, as I said, a lot of NGOs in different contexts and regarding different ethnic groups um, that gather information really systematically, really professionally on different languages, different platforms, and they say we have to hold these people accountable that are posting this, right? So they are saying they're going up to, let's say, Meta, and they're giving them this information and saying, let's work together. We know that you are not interested in doing this yourself, so we're helping you, and let's find a solution together to delete this content, to go against these people in court, or to ban them from your platforms. So I think that the problem is, and the good thing is at the same time, is that NGOs are taking up much of the work of collecting information. The question is whether this should be the work of NGOs. And the second question is whether companies like Meta are actually listening to the amazing work that is being done on collecting the human rights violations on social media. And that is something that is very recent. So we will see in the next years to what extent NGOs are actually effective in changing anything in terms of protecting human rights online.
Thank you, Esther. We had a lot of questions for you. I'm sorry you were the only speaker for today, and thank you to the audience. And since we talked about social media and all of that, I do want to encourage all of you to read our very most recent publication. It's on hate speech that's been promoted by the Aliyev administration, and most of the information has been extracted from various social media accounts, and it's an extensive report on hate speech, violations of human rights, and everything that has happened since the provisional orders of ICJ in December of 2021. So I invite you all to go to our website, cftjjustice.org, and read the most recent report. Logistically, we are going to end a little bit early for this session, for the panel, because we do not have one of our speakers present. We're going to come back at 3:30, so we're going to have a coffee break. We have some speakers who are joining us from New York City, which is why we have to wait a little bit before we, connect with him. So coffee break, and I'll see you guys back at 3:30.